On the nuclear side, this is a story, again, of human excellence, of thousands of people working at these plants, doing an absolutely fantastic job, reaching really high levels of excellence. But we never get to meet those people or talk to those people. And, that's the privilege that I've had over the last few years. And I think, one of the challenges going forward, increasing public acceptance. Year after year, we're seeing very high levels of acceptance.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/The Rational View. Together, we can make a better future.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. 2023 was a big year for the perception and advancement of nuclear power, not only in Canada, but globally. In this episode, I'm interviewing friend of Rational View and fellow podcaster, Dr. Chris Keefer, to reminisce about the work his group, Canadians for Nuclear Energy, has accomplished in the past year. If you enjoy the podcast, I urge you to press like on your podcast app and help me spread the profile of this podcast around so that other people can see it and get a piece of The Rational View. Come join me on my Facebook group, The Rational View. I'd love to hear your opinions on what you hear today. Chris Keefer is an emergency room physician, medical simulation educator, nuclear energy advocate, and podcaster. He's the medical director of EM Deliberate Practice, the president of Canadians for Nuclear Energy, and director of Doctors for Nuclear Energy, and the host of the Decouple Podcast. Chris, welcome back to The Rational View.
Hey, Al, it's great to be back with you. What a wordy introduction. Some of those things are a little bit dormant, just in case your audience thinks that I don't sleep at all. I occasionally do. But
I'm amazed at how much you actually do accomplish, though, in the time available to you as an emergency room doctor. I mean, obviously, that's a huge time commitment to be pushing basically a global agenda on nuclear energy and leading Canadians into this nuclear future is a tremendous effort. So congratulations on what you've done. I want to, in this podcast episode, maybe go over the year 2023 in review and just, it was a busy year for you and the Canadians for Nuclear Energy. I think the global perspective on nuclear power is changing significantly, especially over the last 12 months. People seem to be coming around in general to the concept of nuclear as an environmentally friendly alternative and a method to address climate change with all of the good things that come with a stable base load and a just transition from fossil fuels to another high performing energy source. Why do you think we've had so much success over the last year? What do you think is behind this change?
Well, I think we have to look back a little bit further because you're right. There's been a ton of progress, particularly this year, but it's been building. The momentum's been building, that snowball going down the hill, which is now boulder sized. It got started a little earlier than that. What's so extraordinary, I think, is going back to when you and I first became aware of this issue and started thinking about it. As you mentioned, Emerge Doc, this was an unforeseen set of activities. My background's been more in kind of humanitarian causes, but really come to see energy in humanitarian terms. But yeah, going back a little bit further, I just got back from COP28 in Dubai. That's the Conference of the Parties, where this year, I think it was almost 100,000 people jetted in, some in private jets, some in passenger jets.
Save the world.
Very few, making it the way that Greta did, I guess, over to North America by sailboat a few years ago. But in any case, these huge gatherings where the wording of documents, phase outs versus phase downs seems to consume an incredible amount of diplomatic capital. But in any case, the first one I went to was in Glasgow, in 3 years ago in 2021. I guess that's 2 years ago. And what an incredible sea change. And that's really where in the Canadian front, we had I guess, kind of base level of where attitudes were at was very apparent. And I think that's a good contrast for us. So in 2021, I had this wonderful sort of viral video moment where I was able to confront Stephen Guilbeault, our former and current Minister of Environment and Climate Change, former Greenpeace activist. The guy had been sort of present at every anti-nuclear moment imaginable, trying to shut down the Pickering nuclear station, et cetera. He at one point rappelled off the CN Tower in a statement against climate change. In any case, this guy came with a lot of blinders, and coming out of a talk about powering past coal put on by the World Wildlife Fund, I managed to ambush him and essentially call him out, asking him if his anti-nuclear priors would shadow his judgment, giving the emergent scientific consensus on the need for nuclear power to combat climate change. This is a minister who, like, at every opportunity when asked about nuclear, dodges the question. Usually it's Minister Wilkinson, Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, who takes the question, but was very reflective of the time. We were getting into this again as the German nuclear phase out built momentum, as the Belgium nuclear phase out was again gaining momentum as well. And just over these last 2 years, we've really seen reversals there. Unfortunately, Germany carried through with what I heard creatively referred to as, industrial seppuku, referring to the Japanese method of splitting your abdomen open with a short blade out of honor. But in many other places, we've seen a total turnaround. France, many people would be surprised by that. A country that has gotten up to 75% of its electricity from nuclear had a plan to phase out down to 50%, just out of this kind of European anti-nuclear zeitgeist. A bit of a reaction to Fukushima and this idea that just nuclear was sunsetting as a power source. And this year, the announcement of plans for 6 new large reactors, and just this week saying that's not going to be enough. We're going to need another 8 more for a total of 14. So this is all happening within a global context.
It's huge.
For sure. And in terms of Canada, again, I gave you a bit of a background. In terms of our governing Liberal Party, a real split between a number of important ministries and even the Prime Minister's office, who were really captured by environmental NGOs. Many, if not most, of the PMO staffers were former World Wildlife Fund operatives with a clear anti-nuclear agenda. And as I mentioned, Stephen Guilbeault, former Greenpeacer. Those are folks really setting the agenda. But there is this other base, right? And this is the advantage that Canada has, I think, over a lot of other countries that are considering nuclear or, disadvantaged by nuclear bans, like our sister nation of Australia, is that we have a momentum here. We have 76,000 people that work in this sector that, can demonstrate what the opportunities are like, what the, high skilled jobs are available. And those folks vote. And that's really been, our strategy at Canadians for Nuclear Energy is to find a sort of base of people that will advocate. And obviously there's diehards like you and I that are very involved. But again, in terms of mobilizing a base, that's what we were able to do really with our House of Commons petition campaigns, which have ultimately, had a big impact on things like the Green Bond. I'm going to get off my diatribe here and let you get some questions in edgewise, but hopefully that gives your listeners a bit of context.
No, you're very dynamic and you have a lot of answers. Canadians for Nuclear Energy, I think, has made great headway in changing the discussion around nuclear power in Canada from a fear-based narrative to a rational one, which we obviously here at the Rational View approve. What would you say was your biggest success of 2023 as a group?
I'm going to harken back again, just not to get stuck within 2023. I know it's kind of the end of year wrap up, and I'm might be annoying you with how I'm dodging some questions here, but I think just a great example was back from 2022. Sheila Whittock, who's an active member of our group and works on the Deep Geologic Repository front, really combating a lot of fear mongering, both locally and supported by an activist network more broadly. Invited me to come up to Teeswater, the potential site of the Canadian Deep Geologic Repository, to give a talk called The Physician's Perspective on Nuclear Waste. And it's this kind of boots on the ground interactions with folks coming, without judgment, listening to concerns, and communicating in a way that, frankly, organizations like the Nuclear Waste Management Organization really struggle to. I empathized with them. I said, listen, ultimately, this is your choice whether to approve or disapprove this project. If I lived here and this was my backyard, my concerns would be more about a large industrial development, a lot of dump trucks moving aggregate around. But let me bring the perspective on radiation here. And, I got to spend a lot of time with the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, speaking with geologists, speaking with corrosion experts and others. A culture of, highly, highly trained people working in these extreme silos, a guy just dedicated to, understanding copper corrosion in anoxic environments, 500 meters down in this rock formation.
Yes.
But, I spoke to the guy involved with the risk modeling, and I said, listen, just give me the worst case scenario of, if everything goes wrong at this, high level nuclear waste storage facility, 500 meters underground. And what he told me was it would take 1 million years with a whole bunch of assumptions. They had one assumption in the worst case scenario that it's called an all cask failure scenario. And this would be that, these highly engineered casks, not only do they have a little micro crack in a weld, but they're just not there. Like, to give you a sense of how they set up these assumptions to disadvantage themselves. And there's some massive geologic fault that they haven't discovered, with essentially like a river of water going through, and the maximally exposed theoretical person has a ground well, drinks all their water from the most contaminated spot, grows all their food in that area. And I said, well, what is that maximum dose? Well, it takes 1 million years, and it's 80 nanosieverts. And for context, that's about the dose you get from having a smoke alarm in your house in 1 million years. Right. And so, but that's
not the worst case without so we're putting in all these extra layers of protection that, really don't do anything other than protect us from 80 nanosieverts 1 million years from now. Is that?
Yeah. And 80 nanosieverts a year.
Why are we doing this?
Yeah. No, exactly.
Just to make it more expensive. So I think, nuclear as an industry has fallen victim to this, the ALARA principle, right? As low as reasonably achievable is kind of the philosophy that is applied to radiation dose. So, and this, what it means is make it as expensive as other sources of energy and just a little bit more, even if you don't need to, right? Other sources of energy like coal and gas can pollute at will, spread their exhaust products into the atmosphere and use dilution. But nuclear is special. Nuclear can't kill anybody 1 million years from now. It's this unlevel playing field that just roasts me, because at the rational view here, that's not rational. Mm-hmm. And I think much of the environmental opposition to nuclear power, from environmentalists who should love this, I think is coming from degrowthers who've been using climate change. They've seen this as their golden lever to overturn the prevailing economic systems and tear down capitalism. And this is where I think we get a lot of pushback from the people who should be with us. They're not really environmentalists. They're actually anti-capitalists who have agglomerated onto this cause because they've seen it as a lever. What do you think of that perspective on who we're pushing against here?
Yeah, I'd say it's that's definitely an element what you're describing there. Obviously, nuclear is a dual-use technology, and unfortunately, it made its global debut in the form of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. And there was a need, I think. Well, maybe not a need, but there was a natural reaction, which was to fearmonger about, particularly about radiation. Most of the injuries from those bombs were traditional blast and thermal injuries. Certainly there was a radiation component, but about 10-15% of the casualties were radiation related. But that was the special thing about this bomb. In addition to its sheer explosive power, was this radiation element, which was provoked a lot of fear. And that fear was built upon in order to try and create a world in which we would never use these things again. And, God willing, we never will. Yeah. But, I always try and be compassionate and try and put myself in the shoes of my opponents. And ultimately, that's very helpful, not just to kind of win the fight, but also just to, there's a saying, like it takes a smart person to win an argument, but a wise person to win an agreement, to win a mutual understanding. And again, anyway, that's kind of my effort. And I think I'm botching the quote there. But
I see.
Yeah, I think it's that tie to nuclear weapons that ultimately drives much of the environmental objections to nuclear, and that
Okay.
sort of special idea that radiation is a particularly dangerous force within nature. And as you and I know, it's especially at low doses, it is an incredibly weak carcinogen compared to some of the things you were discussing there, like particulate air pollution and chemotoxins. What I will say, in terms of the, because I'm a medical doctor, I interact at a pretty high level with folks from across the nuclear sector. And I think, what is assumed by the outside is, these folks are always, based on The Simpsons, essentially, right? But trying to cut corners, playing fast and loose with safety. And what I found is the absolute opposite to a almost pathological sense. And, I think that's illustrated a little bit by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. You step in there and you start off with this just kind of shocked reaction to these guys are chasing safety margins, which are just illogical and irrational, right? And then there's sort of a second phase where you go, but this is incredible. I mean, the amount of like human excellence that's going into trying to be as perfect as possible, that's kind of cool. And then you leave and you go back into your own orbit and you go, these people are crazy again. It's just an interesting experience. But, we see this all the time in a field which is so technical, is nuclear engineering solutions to communications problems. Or, in the case of a lot of the hyper and small modular reactors, a nuclear solution to a financing problem. The nuclear industry really struggles to match the solution to the problem they're trying to address. And that example of, again, trying to engineer down to a radiation dose in this completely unrealistic scenario of less than a smoke detector per year is just, I think, probably one of the most emblematic things out there. And for me, I mean, I'm an emergency doctor. I care deeply about our public services. I know that the amount of capital we have to dedicate towards, social entitlements, healthcare, education is limited. It's based upon the productivity of our economy. So I don't want to see capital misallocated. And so, my question to the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is, okay, how much less could we spend to get to 2 smoke detectors worth of radiation in a million years, or 10 or 100, right? Because right now the plan is
even a banana.
The plan is to spend close to $26 billion on this facility. And, I think you could get it down to the single billions, and, not have any meaningful impact on human health and be able to spend, another 10, 15, 16 billion on the things I really care about, which are, the ingredients of human flourishing, good healthcare, good education, et cetera.
The problem, I think, is a bureaucratic one. The previous governments have allocated something like $22 billion to this, right? That they have a fund already existing that they've taken from the operating profits of nuclear over the last several decades, and they have like $22 billion available for this fund. So the people that are working to it say, yes, I've got all this money to spend. What can I do? Yeah. I think that's the wrong perspective. And then they see this Alera principle and they don't question it, right? We have to get this as low as reasonably achievable. Not as low as, other sources of energy, or as low as acceptable to the public, because no power source is perfectly safe. People fall off roofs installing solar panels, windmills fall over and every now and then kill people. You're never going to be perfect in anything. And sure, it's great to strive for this, but as you say, it's not rational what you need to do is look for your lives per dollar metric in terms of how you're spending this. And there are so many better ideas. You in the medical field, I'm sure, are aware of many of them. But let me shift the argument or the discussion a little bit, and talk about some of the successes we've had. Pickering, for example. Wow, the fact that we got Canadian government or the Ontario government to say, wait a minute, maybe we should think about keeping Pickering. What does that mean to Ontario and to Canada? What does that change of heart mean in terms of energy and in terms of our going forward?
Well, I mean, we were heading towards taking a massive step backwards on both carbon emissions and on air pollution. Pickering, it's hard to imagine before you get into this world just how much power is produced by a facility that's the size of a large shopping mall. But it's about equivalent to the Canadian side of Niagara Falls. which is about 15% of Ontario's electricity. The plan to refurbish Pickering was considered in the early 2000s. The environmental impact assessment was approved. Plans were made. But there was a lot of kind of going back and forth at that time on how much electricity we actually needed. We just suffered the global financial crisis. We deindustrialized a lot of Ontario, and energy demand dropped quite a bit. And, as a politician, I'm sympathetic. You don't want to overbuild your electricity supply because it's a major cost to your ratepayers. And you're always trying to, balance things and get prices that are affordable for the population. I'm sympathetic with that. There was also at that point the plan to build new large nuclear at the Darlington station. So, bids were coming in for about 2,000 megawatts, which would have replaced, a decent chunk of Pickering. And so for that reason, the decision was made not to refurbish, but we've had decision after decision to life extend the plant, to do the maintenance required to keep the plant going. And it's operating better than ever, actually. Which is, I think, quite a testament to the durability of the technology and the excellence of the people running it. But in any case, the plan, as you and I know, when we got into this fight just over 3 years ago, was for this facility to retire in 2024, 2025. And, we looked at that as people that are concerned about climate, concerned about air pollution, concerned about a just transition, about, good, dignified jobs for our fellow Ontarians and Canadians, and said, this is just not right. I think we took a moral position on this. We got a lot of pushback, actually, from the nuclear industry itself. There was a path dependency here. OPG had decided they were not going to refurbish this plant. They didn't want to refurbish this plant. But, we really kept up the fight, developed the rhetoric, the argumentation, and actually researched and wrote a really excellent 30-page policy proposal, which, because of the way that we have, worked alongside and gained the respect of the labor movement, we're able to get into the hands of the Premier and into the Minister of Energy and the Minister of Labor for some consideration. And as I was mentioning, electricity demand sort of leveled off or decreased after the financial crisis, but we're in a different period now where we're reindustrializing Ontario, where we're trying to take advantage of some of the hope around battery electric vehicles, for instance, or making low carbon steel, or just our population growth. And there's a realization that we're seeing a real uptick in projected demand, and shutting off 15% of your electricity just does not make sense in that regard. Now, Pickering is it's a more vehicles. Yeah, it's a more challenging station to refurbish than the Darlington and Bruce stations, which have been tremendously successful. In this era in the Western world, we don't hear about any mega project coming in on budget and on or even ahead of schedule, and we're seeing that here in Ontario. That was hard fought. Our earliest refurbishments in Pickering in the early 2000s did not go terribly well in terms of project management. But, the institutional excellence has been gained. The human resources are there. And this is just, I think, such an interesting story about nuclear. When we think about nuclear, we see these big hulking power stations, fences around them, and the people that work there are kind of mysterious. Yeah. I make this contrast to healthcare, right? Where highly, highly complex system, which incorporates, the medical device industry, the pharmaceutical industry, all the bureaucrats working in our hospitals and uniting a whole healthcare system. But it's a public facing, people, narrative heavy story where, you interact with doctors and nurses and you have this human sense of a whole service and industry. On the nuclear side, this is a story, again, of human excellence, of thousands of people working at these plants, doing an absolutely fantastic job, reaching really high levels of excellence. But we never get to meet those people or talk to those people. And, that's the privilege that I've had over the last few years. And I think, one of the challenges going forward in terms of increasing public acceptance, although, as you noted, year after year, we're seeing very high levels of acceptance. So we have a plan now. I'm finally going to get back to your initial question. What has happened in 2023? Well, I think, in addition to the government's stated intention of refurbishing Pickering now, there's talk of increasing our nuclear fleet by about 50%. So adding 6,000 megawatts or, 6 to 8 large reactors worth of electricity from nuclear to the grid. That's something that the Ontario population supports. Recent polling from Angus Reid says about 75% of the population is for this. Only 12% are opposed, and the remainder, aren't quite sure yet. But this is a huge ringing endorsement. And I hope, our activism and media presence has played a part in that.
Sure has.
But the tides are shifting, and I think people understand that our dabbling in the wind and solar experiment in Ontario has not been a particularly high value proposition, and understand if we're going to run big factories and we're going to electrify things like steel, that you need reliable baseload power to do that with.
Let's touch on that point a little bit, because this is one that a lot of people don't understand. People think that wind and solar is very cheap and nuclear is very expensive. This is an ingrained, trained response of most people. Like, why aren't we using the cheaper wind and solar? Why would we go to such an expensive thing as nuclear? How do you address that when people bring that up to you? Because you obviously must get this all the time.
For sure. I mean, there's a number of ways to slice this. When people talk about how cheap wind and solar are, they're generally using this levelized cost of electricity measure, which is an economic measure useful in planning out an energy system. It used to be very useful because we were talking about comparing power stations that were pretty similar, dispatchable thermal stations like a coal plant or a gas plant or a nuclear plant. So it held up fairly well. There are some differences. I mean, these involve things like discount rates, where the assumed power produced is over a 20 or 30-year window, and we're seeing nuclear stations, being relicensed into the 80-year period, potentially 100-year period. And so that has to, be reflected in the way that we value this kind of long-term power generation. But with wind and solar entering the market, levelized cost of electricity does not look at everything that's required to integrate these intermittent, unreliable power sources into the grid. And so, yes, when a solar panel is producing electricity, if you look at it just in isolation, that is the cheapest electricity available. But when we look at electricity as a service, which is really what it is, and I, again, make this comparison to healthcare all the time, you don't just need a doctor there when they feel like, being on shift in the emergency department. We need to organize a whole system with a lot of, scheduling, a lot of organization and thoughtfulness to how do we have the resources available for the public when they have, a car accident at 3 a.m. We need to have the doctors and nurses on staff. And so you can think about the electricity system in a similar way. Wind and solar are a little bit like doctors and nurses that just come to work when they feel like it and take off when they feel like it. And you'll never have a solar doctor that will work a night shift, for instance. And so then what's required is to have a huge sort of on-call pool of health professionals that can come in at a moment's notice and try and keep the whole hospital operating 24/7 as it needs to do. And that becomes very expensive. So hopefully that kind of narrative arc can leave your listeners with a bit of a deeper understanding as to why. And it is sometimes hard to get your head around why something that is so cheap when it's available is not reflected in the systems cost of keeping a vital service like healthcare or like our electricity grid, in smooth operation.
Yeah, I've looked into this on-call power that backs up the solar and wind, and it has to ramp very quickly. And typically, the solution is called gas peaker plants. So they respond to peaks when a cloud goes by or the wind suddenly drops across a large area. And these things are just continually burning gas to keep their generators rolling, and then they ramp up really quickly. And because of this, they're actually extremely inefficient compared to baseload gas, which is what people, compare. We're using a little bit of gas to back up wind and solar. Well, it's not as efficient as normal gas in terms of its environmental footprint. Its carbon footprint is probably twice as bad as baseload gas because of the inefficiency of peaking this. So, and this is something that OPG had purchased, right? They had purchased several gas plants to take the place of Pickering when it was supposed to be retired. So that's why we had pushback from OPG, is they'd already purchased these gas plants to back up to fill in for the nuclear, the zero emission nuclear. So, this is the row we had to hoe to get this, the provincial government to reconsider this and to force OPG to look at a more environmentally friendly solution. Let's talk a little bit about what the future is going to look like in Ontario and in Canada in terms of nuclear pathways. People have been talking about these new SMRs. There's a new one being built at Darlington, a demonstration plant. I think AECL is planning to build one up in Chalk River. And then there's the old can-do technology that we're now refurbishing at Darlington and Bruce and hopefully Pickering. Where do you see as that we should be going as Canadians for Nuclear Energy? Where does your strategy lead us?
Well, I mean, we're a large, diverse country with provinces with radically different needs, populations, and grid sizes. So there's a role for different sizes of nuclear across this country, and I would separate that into three categories. And hopefully, this can sort of disambiguate the SMR concept. So we need micro reactors for remote communities and remote mines if we're serious about decarbonizing the North, and also providing energy security. We're seeing with increasingly unpredictable weather and ice flows, we have communities where sometimes we need to fly in diesel fuel to run electric generators, and that is just extraordinarily expensive. But otherwise, you got to barge it in. If you have unfavorable ice conditions, you need to make sure you have, sometimes 6 months to a year worth of heating oil and diesel stored on site. So there's big opportunities in the far north and remote regions for what are called micro reactors, which can provide both heat and electricity. And incidentally, I lived right on the border of a actually pretty large Indigenous reserve in southern Ontario, and they had this huge natural gas heated greenhouse. But it became this real focal point, like a little tropical vacation you could come to and grow your traditional tobacco or some fruits and veggies and things like that. Of course, not good for the climate because they were burning an obscene amount of gas to heat it up. But you can imagine the kind of prosperity you could have just in terms of heat prosperity. I mean, you could have like a spa, you could have a nicely heated greenhouse, you could use district heating, which is a great way to use that sort of lower temperature waste heat from a nuclear reactor, and reliable electricity. So that's the kind of vision for the North. It's not the highest yield in terms of our carbon reductions. I mean, they are burning a significant amount of fossil fuels in the far north, but these are very small communities. So I'm always thinking from a medical perspective of triage and how we can devote limited resources to get the biggest bang for our buck, to basically be utilitarian. So important use case, but not the greatest sort of way to reduce our emissions. A second scale that we need is these grid scale small modular reactors, so about 300 megawatts. And that is what you're mentioning is being deployed at the Darlington nuclear site. And so the vision here is to deploy these sizes of reactors in places like New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Alberta, Saskatchewan. You can't have a single generator that's more than about 10% of your grid capacity, because if that has to go offline for maintenance or trips offline, then that introduces too much instability to your grid.
Right.
So we have that kind of a sizing. And then lastly, we have what you referred to as our old can-do technology, which I'll push back against a little bit. We have newer iterations of can-do, which have been produced through the lineage of this design. This is a really special reactor. There are only 3 widely deployed reactor technologies that have survived and proved themselves to be the best technologies. 2 of them are American, the pressurized light water reactor and the boiling light water reactor. And we have the pressurized heavy water reactor, which we designed here in Canada to take advantage of our natural uranium and to ensure that we could produce a reactor domestically without relying on foreign supply chains. And again, these are the 3 widely deployed reactors which have proved to be economic, which have proved to have operational excellence and to be quite long-lived. And while this reactor technology was developed in the 50s and 60s, there's been this iterative process of learning, of gaining operational experience. And there's this love affair right now with innovation in nuclear. And there's 2 sort of types of innovation. One is, getting out a set of sort of priorities and hitting the blueprints and designing something that's totally novel, maybe in terms of the coolant that's reused. Maybe we're not going to use water. We're going to use sodium metal, or we're going to use
high temperature
gas.
reactors.
Yeah. And that's an important area of research. But the more pragmatic innovation comes from operational experience of a nuclear power plant that we use now, that we know that works now, and making that better and better and better. And that's what's
Yeah.
led to the extraordinary advances in the operations of our nuclear fleet, both in Canada and abroad, where early on these reactors weren't anticipated to be online more than 50% of the time, and we're up in the 90% range. There's certainly a role for innovation in the coolants and the moderators, but that innovation isn't just starting now. It's been ongoing since the 50s and 60s, and there's a reason that our water-based technologies have risen to the top. They've outperformed these other reactor designs. So I think what we see around the world is a need to have a strong basis in existing high-performance technology, and then to do some research around the edges. So just to kind of answer for your listeners some of those questions around, well, what about this advanced nuclear stuff, or isn't CANDU old?
Yes.
We are working now on the largest CANDU reactor which will ever be deployed, which is in the 1,000 megawatt scale. So what was SNC Lavalin, which is now Atkins Realis, has been asked by the utilities to make a reactor that's slightly larger than the ones we have at Darlington. And they are on a rush protocol to do that, to have a reactor ready in time to put in a bid at the Bruce station, where we're looking at, again, 4,800 megawatts of new nuclear. So that would be about 4 to 5 large CANDU units there. What does that mean for Ontario? It means that we're building off a real strength that we have here. Ontario, we started off with a decent endowment of hydroelectricity, mostly at Niagara Falls, but scattered across the province. But we don't have the kind of resources that Quebec has, for instance. And we quickly outstripped that, and we started adding coal, which was what was available at the time. That coal was not from in province. If we had coal mines in Ontario, we'd probably still be using the stuff, but we had to import it from either the Atlantic provinces or out west on trains, very expensive, and later on barges from the US. We were impacted by all kinds of things like coal strikes in the US, or the lakes freezing and not being got the barges across, or just big price oscillations. And because we had this center of nuclear excellence, the largest nuclear research center outside of the US in the post-war period, and we decided we want to be a high-tech country, we want to really lean into our engineering prowess and our advantages, we developed the CANDU reactor, and we've, again, continued to iterate and improve that. So, I'm really excited. I know we got to wrap up soon, about, the direction that we're headed, the way that we've steered the ship. I'm sorry we didn't get to, I could list them off quickly, some of the accomplishments of this year. But we have nuclear, all forms of nuclear, large, small, refurbishment in our clean tech investment tax credit, which is Canada's response to the Inflation Reduction Act. We fought hard to get nuclear included within our green bond framework, which is going to ease financing for these projects, which are quite capital intensive. We're going to get Pickering refurbished. We expect that formal announcement later this month. We're seeing not just one, but 4 SMRs promised for Darlington. And again, that large nuclear project, which is being planned carefully now at Bruce. So I think a really bright future. We should continue with the strengths that we have, with this nuclear powered province, nuclear being the second cheapest source of electricity on our grid, and what provides us with the power required, the baseload power required to reindustrialize this province for the benefit of Ontarians and for the benefit of the climate, doing that with ultra low carbon, really the lowest life cycle emissions power source that we have.
Chris, thank you so much for coming and telling us about the work that you guys have been doing. It's impressive, and thank you so much for doing it and leading this work, because it's critical. And I'm so happy that rational thinking is starting to come into the picture. It's been a lot of work, and it always is. And as you say, it takes these one-on-one discussions. It takes the personal touch to go in and, empathize with people and address their fears and show that we have common goals of improving, life for everyone in this province. And, look at the progress we've made in nuclear and getting rid of coal and cleaning the air and just saving lives. The nuclear medicine of the isotope production of the CANDU reactors for supporting nuclear medicine. It's certainly a great success story. And I'm looking forward to the angle of the just transition to maybe help leverage this into other provinces, to replace the coal plants in Alberta and replacing, all of these gas plants with other high-tech jobs that are sustainable and environmentally friendly and don't pollute the air and kill people. So I really appreciate the work you've done, and thank you for coming on. I know you're a very busy guy. Appreciate you coming and chatting again, and we'll have to do this again soon. Thank you so much.
Beautiful, beautiful. And it's shameless pitch here. If you want to support the work of C4NE, we have a donate button on the website. So go to www.c4ne.ca. We can use your support, and we've accomplished so much, but there's always more to do. So thank you for considering that, and thank you for having me on, Al. Pleasure.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.